What is up, everybody? It's Thursday night. Thursday night means one thing. Doc Talk is back. Tonight, we're talking about some crankbaits. Let's get into this thing. What is up, everybody? Gosh, it's good to see you. It's good to see my guy sitting over here. We got a guy we call Biscuit. This is Gravy. The one, the only Marcas Grubbs is in the house tonight. Um, we got Joey Monteleone coming in, and let's see here. As soon as I get him the right link, let's see. That ain't it. So, yeah, we're working on this whole thing. There we go. So Joey will be joining us here in just a few minutes, but we got a special show for you guys tonight here on Doc Talk. Got a couple guys that like throwing some lip baits around, the old crankbait. Made me pull my old DT22 off the rack here behind me, and yeah, we're gonna jump into this thing, man. So while we're waiting on Joey, man, how's your winter been?
Dude, it's been all right. I've been itching to fish though, man. I watched that MLF live. That was awesome. So that got me really wanting to do some. Had to hit the local pond and rip a lipless around and caught a baby bass, and scratch the itch for a few days.
It's good to have the first fish of the year out of the way. Speaking of guys that got probably will have the first fish of the year out of the way, Mr. Joey's made it in the house. I apologize. I thought I got you the link. So
No, we're
welcome
good.
to the show, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how's your winter been, Joey? What's been going on down there in Tennessee?
What's winter?
Yeah. It was that
Well,
few weeks in January, I'm pretty
yeah,
sure.
yeah. Well, if you're talking about strictly 2025, it's been okay. The cold weather kept us off. But I tell you, in December, we loaded the boat. I mean, it was a great December. And I know a lot of people, hey, Marcus, how are you?
How you doing, Joey?
Good. A lot of people kind of put their gear up, October, they kind of, and, whether you're deer hunting or whatever it is that you do, we're saying, well, the holidays or whatever. I mean, you can make excuses for not going, but I tell people you can't catch them from the couch. And, we had a pretty nice, December, and we found a school of crappie that was unbelievable. We stayed on the
Wow.
crappie, and the bass bite was good. And my first fish of 2025 was a 7.5 pound largemouth on a chatterbait. And we live on Woods Reservoir, so I can't use the excuse anymore that we're learning the lake, because I think we've been here 2 years. We're starting to figure it out, but it's been good. It's been really good.
Nice, nice. Well, as
That's
we said
awesome.
before, we're going to be talking about a little bit of crankbaiting tonight. Lipless is definitely an option for crankbaits. Yeah, you guys ready to
There
get
you
into
go.
this thing?
Yep.
Let's do it.
So let's jump right into the questions. These guys have had a chance to look at some questions that I'd sent over today, but when we're talking about crankbaits, what are the differences in selections? Talking about the fish right out of the gate, what are the different selections that you guys might make for largemouth, spotted bass, and smallmouth? Because I mean, different animals here.
Totally. I'm personally not super good at catching smallmouth, so when I'm crankbait fishing, I'm usually fishing super shallow and fishing for largemouth. But I do at the places where there's a lot of both or all three varieties. I just catch them all shallow.
Oh, well, then, yeah. And well, the hard part is, I personally believe, and I know you guys both have experience with smallmouth, that it's harder to pattern a smallmouth than it is any other fish.
Oh
They're,
yeah,
it's not like
they're
they're here
crazy.
one day and gone the next. They're here 1 hour and gone the next.
Right.
Very
And
much.
I think we're lucky to live on a lake that we don't have any spotted bass here. Although across Tennessee we've got a lot of spots, a lot of Kentuckys, but the lake that we're on, I was talking to Bill Dance a couple of weeks ago, and his personal best smallmouth on this lake was 8.4, and he caught it on a spinnerbait. And I know that there's big smallmouth here. My biggest has been 6.5, and I've caught several in the 5.5 to 6.5 pound category, and a few of them on crankbaits. And somebody asked me one day, and I'm not the greatest on social media, but a guy asked me one day, he said, "Can you tell me when the best time?" Because I've shot a picture of me with this smallmouth that I caught on a wiggle wart. Before you guys were born, there was a company called Storm Lures that made the wiggle wart, and I've got some of the original ones. And the one that I had was a custom painted one from Tony Evans. We call it Bloodshot. It's silver with red, and it's got a wider wobble. And when the water gets into the low 50s, I start throwing that wiggle wart. And in the same day, I had a 6.5 smallmouth and a 6 pound largemouth, probably within 30 minutes of each other. So I think water temperature plays a key role in when you want to throw crankbaits and which one you want to throw.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Very much. That was a great answer. Sorry, I'm trying to share this out. I'm behind tonight. I don't know. I'm out of practice, out of the loop. Yeah. So, talking about crankbaits here a little bit, what are some of your favorite crankbaits that you guys use?
Me personally, my absolute favorite, I got the most confidence in, is probably like a Fritz Side 5. Just catches everything pretty much all year for me too, and the 7s and the 9s as well. I've gotten on one of my best bites ever on a 7. Just schooled up fish, couldn't keep them off the bait. So I've got a ton of confidence in that tight wobble and shallow diving crankbait. It's silent too most of the time. I throw the silent ones. But then a DT6, it's hard to beat a DT6. That's one of my favorites. And then like a KVD square bill. Who can beat that in the summertime when they're up on the bluegill beds and stuff, So that's where my crankbait confidence comes in, like just shallow. Usually that 5 to 7 foot range.
Well, that puts you in a category of a lot of folks that we want to. The shallow water fish are there for two reasons. They're there to spawn or to eat. And I've gotten to fish with David Fritz several times, and there's nothing like reading something, but there's really nothing like being in a boat with somebody that I used to call him the king of crankbait fishermen. I did several articles with him and about him. And as far as I'm a Strike King guy because I'm sponsored by Strike King. But if their baits don't work, I wouldn't be using them. And I'm with Marcus on the 1.5. There's something very specific about that. As far as I'm concerned, about the what I call a deflection bite. And with that 1.5, and I thought about this earlier, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I know I'll fish a crankbait different than most people because I'm sponsored. So if I break one off, I've got 10 more of them at home. So it's not like I'm worried about it. So that does change the game for people a little bit. When people say, well, I don't want to throw in there, I'm liable to get hung up. Well, you're going to get hung up. Yeah. And sometimes it's going to be on a bass, especially when you're running. I had a spot. Chad, you need to come down here and fish with me. I got a spot where, and I target steep banks with large submerged trees on them. You throw that crankbait, that 1.5 across that tree trunk. When you hit that, you can almost count it down 3, 2, 1, and then you get bit. I had a pattern like that lasted all fall that we could have shot a video. We could have shot a TV show in 22 minutes because the bite was that good. And as far as color goes, I think I really hate to say this, but I think people get too tied up in colors. And it's just my belief that if you have three colors, it should be a shad pattern, a craw pattern, and either a fire tiger or chartreuse blackback. And I'll tell you, year after year after year, Strike King would tell you chartreuse blackback is their number one selling color every year. And again, if you've got those three colors, you're prepared for any watercolor, any water condition. And and if you have a 1.5 and like somebody's number 3, which usually will dive 6 to 10 feet. And I'm not a deep cranking guy. That one you held up before, I won't throw those. It's like an A-rig. I'm too lazy to throw that. I just got to be honest about it. If I get to a tournament,
it'll wear your arms out.
Yeah, it will. And one little tip I'll tell you. You did mention this in the questions. One little tip is if you're in your kayak and you throw that, put that rod across your foot where you can let your foot absorb that, and point your rod tip down. Let your foot absorb that vibration instead of your shoulder. It's not going to change anything other than you're going to feel a little better at the end of the day. So that's the 3 colors that I would suggest people to buy right off the bat.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on those colors. That's all I buy.
Now, I
really.
think you guys talk about the 1.5. I think a crankbait in that square bill for Strike King that maybe goes a little bit underrated is the OG1S. That is a little bitty dude. I mean, it's probably an inch, maybe. Man, it's caught a lot of fish. You just use, I think it's, gosh, can't remember what size of hooks I put on it. But anyway, put the KVD hooks on it, mustad hooks, and just run that dude parallel. Like, after fish get done spawning, man, that thing is clutch. They love it.
Yeah.
You got a lot of little bait running around.
We already know when we go out there which baits we're going to throw. So I've got those 3 colors that I talked about, and then that custom color, that bloodshot color that I really believe in. And then it comes down to, it's a 1.5, it's an oval bill, what I call an oval bill, that'll dive to 6 to 10 feet. And then that lipless crankbait. And that's one that doesn't get a lot of press, but I'm telling you, it sure does catch a lot of fish, especially this time of year in really cold water.
Oh my gosh. Best day I've ever had was on a lipless crankbait. That's my favorite.
Yeah. It is. And would you say it probably, I think for us, Marcus, that lipless crankbait bite, it really runs kind of all the way up through May sometimes, just depending on where you're at.
Oh, man. Yeah, I think if you got a bunch of grass, it'll last even longer.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think sometimes people too get tied into that. Well, this is the time to throw a thing. You know what? That lipless crankbait, it'll catch fish all year long, especially fish that
100%.
have been pressured with something else. And I'll tell you something I started doing years ago. I will take a red treble hook and put it on the front. Take a split ring pliers, change out, use the same size hook, and I'm telling you, you'll be surprised how many times you catch that fish on that red hook. Because, not on a red bait, but any other bait, I will throw that red hook on the front. Probably 80-90% of the time I've got that fish, which I want it to be on the front hook. It's going to be hooked a little bit better. So that red hook does make a difference.
Well, what about, let's get into the technique of it here just a little bit. What do you guys recommend on the retrieve for a crankbait? What optimizes, the fish catch ratio as far as when somebody's retrieving it? Are you just burning it in? Are you going slow? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Me personally, I burn them a lot. Depends though. If the water's warm, I'm probably going to burn them pretty fast. Cooler water, I'm pausing a lot more, giving them little breaks here and there, especially if I feel something, but a lot of times I think I run a 7 to 5 a lot of times on the crankbait reel. In the summertime, I'm just running it pretty fast.
Well, when I was fishing, and again, I don't want to beat this to death, but when I was fishing with David Fritz, we were both part of the Browning fishing team, and we owned Lou's at the time. I was the public relations director for Browning Lou's Fishing, and we had, and I still have some of these. They're kind of cumbersome to throw, but these reels, their gear retrieve ratio on these was 5.3 to 1. And by today's standards, when people are all looking for lightning fast reels, David Fritz would get in front of that, and he would crank that so slow. It's like I wanted to climb up there and say, "Can I turn that handle for you? Because I'm getting tired." But he was. I mean, he was catching fish, and the key to that was, when fishing gets tough, regardless of what bait you're throwing, a jig, a spinner bait, whatever. When fishing gets really tough, there's 2 things I tell people: smaller lures and slower retrieves. That will get you fish almost all the time. So, your comment earlier, Chad, about the small crankbait, it's a situational thing. That you have to have that in the back of your mind saying, hey, I'm not afraid to throw this. that, I think that I've got a history with it that says I'm going to catch fish. And that's, I think, for a lot of years, I was a terrible crankbait fisherman. I could hook them. I couldn't get them in. And then I finally figured out it was the rod, the reel, and the line working in combination. And you guys will laugh when I tell you this. I use some old glass rods, some very old glass rods, a slower gear retrieve ratio, and monofilament line, 12 to 14 pound test line, so that they're all working together. So when that fish hits that bait, that rod gets that slow bend. Yes, that rod gives that slow bend. And then once you got them hooked, you can eat a bologna sandwich and smoke a cigar. They're not going anywhere.
I agree. And talking about the slow rod, I drove Marcus nuts several times because I will use a 5.4 a lot of times when I'm throwing a crankbait, even a chatterbait, which is against most people's religion. But a 5.4 reel to me it's just where I live with a crankbait. And a lot of times I think anymore people are fishing so much faster than what they used to, that you can come through with a 5.4 reel and all of a sudden it's something that's a little bit different to that fish. Maybe it's just a little bit slower. You get down a little bit deeper and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I use pretty big line too, so I'm not getting the depth that it's probably rated at either. A lot of times.
Well, and a lot of times just changing your line, like if you wanted to go deeper, what I always tell people, I said, 20-pound test line, 10-pound test line. You're going to get the diameter of that line is going to determine how deep that bait's going to go. And one thing that people never talk about hardly anymore is the material that bait is made of. Years ago, there were a lot of wooden plugs. And again, when I was working for Browning, we owned Poes. I still got a bunch of those old Poes. And the only two times I've ever caught two fish on one bait, it was on a Pose Spook number 300 that probably was diving down 10 to 12 feet. And they look, if you look at them by today's standards, if somebody looks at it and kind of laughs, you won't laugh when you crank that through and start catching those big bass. So I still got some of those and I still fish those. So the profile of a crankbait also is something. If you look at the profile of a minnow, a shad, and a bluegill, whatever they're feeding on, that's going to make a difference. So consider that profile when you're buying your baits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you brought up Bill Dance and talking about all that, but the fat-free shad, the Bill Dance Old Bomber fat-free shad was one of the coolest deep water baits I think ever. That was a fish catching machine.
And I had a friend of mine, Nathan Burnett, that's a crankbait fisherman, and he had one of those and lost it. And I looked through, I've got tackle boxes after they asked me one day on the radio, I do a daily radio spot for AM 650 WSM. And they asked me one day how many tackle boxes I had. I said, I don't know. And I went and looked afterwards and I got 37 tackle boxes and I was looking through them and I found one of those fat-free shad that I gave to Nathan. I said, I'm going to be 74 in a few weeks. I said, I know I'm not going to throw it. So I said, no, you're more than welcome to it. So it was kind of a fun thing. And I guess that's the advantage to being the real OG crankbait guy, is that you got stuff that nobody has anymore. Because if you find something that works, I would tell people buy 6 of them because they may stop making it. Yeah. They may discontinue the color. So if you find something you're in love with, grab them while you can.
Absolutely. That happens, seems like every year. So let's talk about water temperature and different conditions. Obviously right now everybody's pretty much cold for the most part, and we're going to start seeing the warm up as we move into summer and the water's hot. How does temperature affect the choice in your crankbaits? What are you guys doing different depths and styles and whatnot?
Go ahead, Joey.
Oh, okay.
You're good. Sorry.
Our water temperature is currently 56 degrees, and like everybody else, we had that cold spell, and then we had, for a while here, we had southerly winds, and we had some temperatures in the 70s. And water temperature doesn't change. It doesn't go from 46 to 70. It doesn't happen like that. I know people wish it would, but it doesn't. And so, again, what I start doing is it's kind of like playing golf. If you hit it too far to the right, too far to the left, you got a big way to come back. So I stay in the middle a lot of times. So I've got a 1.5 rigged up, and I usually take 5 rods in the kayak with me, and one of them's a spinning rod. So one's always going to be a jig rod, one's going to be a bladed bait or spinnerbait rod, and then maybe 1 or 2 crankbait rods. But I've got them handy, and I'll start with the 1.5. And the wisdom is go to the northwest side of the lake when you first get to this time of the year, because it warms up faster because it gets the most exposure to the sun. Find any kind of hard bottom, boulder, gravel. It can be a long tramp. It can be a bridge piling, and start throwing that. And I start shallow and then work back deep. But if there's heavy cover, throw that crankbait around there, and then move out. As you move out, then you can go to what I call the number 3, the 300, whatever people like to call it, that'll dive 6, 8, 10 feet. And that crank and stop and crank and stop. A lot of times when that thing's rising up, that's when they'll go get it. And a jerk bait, it's not necessarily a crankbait, but a jerk bait in really clear, cold water is, when you find them and they're schooled up, you want to talk about catching some good fish. It's not a numbers deal. It's not a numbers deal, but it's a great fish to position you for, or a bait to position you for a 5, 6, 7 pound fish.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Talking about, the bait on the rise, Marcus fishes a lot of Rapalas. You want to talk about what a Rapala does maybe as it's rising up, especially the DT series?
Yeah. I really like the DTs because they're pretty silent. The 6 and the 10 are basically, I throw the 4 a little bit too, but 6 and the 10's my range. So I really like that balsa action too. I think it's pretty tight. It's pretty finessey. It's good for when that water starts to warm back up. I definitely love that one. And then any kind of flat side, but especially that frit side too. I really like that. And it's silent as well. So the frit side, if I think the bait's a little smaller, I'll throw that frit side because it is a little bit smaller profile, but they're pretty interchangeable. I think David Fritz designed both of them. So.
Well, in that DT series, one of the cool things it does is it's rising up. But what a lot of people don't realize is that bait will actually spin around and look back. And then as you take off again, it flips. It kind of gives it a little bit of a reaction to those fish. And a lot of them do that anymore. Gosh, there's so many crankbaits out there now. It's like, heck, even the Googans have got them.
Right. And I actually have a flat side Googan square bill that I caught a real nice fish on at Patoka a couple years back.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and that brings up a good point. I don't get this question as often anymore. I don't do boat shows anyway. After 35 years, I said, let the young guys have that, the travel and the whatever that everybody else wants to do.
Sure.
I used to tell people, I said, look for baits that have been around 20 or 25 years. And I said, those are the ones you want to buy because they're still catching fish and they may not be qualified as sexy, but I'm telling you something, there's a reason why those baits continue. Again, you can talk about, there's a number of different baits and some of them aren't produced anymore, but the ones that have been around 20, 25 years, and the wigglewort is a classic example that, has been around forever, and it will be around forever as long as it keeps catching fish. And what usually happens is the greatest and latest comes out and everybody forgets about the other stuff they have in their tackle box. And Chad, you and I have talked about this. It's not necessarily a crankbait, but it's what I call the jitterbug mentality. They never stop catching fish. People just quit fishing them. So if you've got baits that work, those are the baits that a go-to. Like if somebody said, if I had to eat what I'm catching, what would I throw? That's the real test. That's the acid test for what you ought to have tied at the end of your line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that stands true to even all the way down into soft plastics. Like, you get away from the Great Lakes and different places like that, and the smallmouth country, and you say tube and people cringe, or you say Carolina rig anymore and people cringe. It's like those still catch a lot of fish.
Yeah,
tubes have that erratic fall. And another little tip for people is and you brought up soft plastics. If you're fishing a jig or a plastic worm or a tube or whatever, and when you're reeling that back, a fish chases it, that's the time to tie on a crankbait because they're in a chase mode already. So they may not want that. And, the slow retrieve, that'll still catch fish. And my wife catches, last year she caught almost 600 bass. And we went 125 days, but she caught almost 600 bass. And she fishes soft plastics probably 95% of the time. But she knows that if you're chasing that, that bait when you come back, and you keep shaking that bait when you're coming back in, you know, that if something follows it all the way to the boat, they're willing to chase it that far. That's the time to tie on a crankbait.
Absolutely. So you kind of went into some of the effective ways to target fish. So let's dive into that. What are you looking for when you're looking for a place that you want to fish this time of year and as it moves throughout the season?
Well, I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. My book's been out for a little while. It's called Strictly Big Bass. And I fish this different than a lot of people do, because I don't want to catch 20 fish in a day unless they all weigh 5 pounds. I'm targeting isolated structure, and it could be offshore by 50 feet, 50 yards. If there's a big submerged tree, if there's a weed bed, edges, those kind of things, that's what I'm really looking for, because I'm looking for that big bite. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I was out the other day and fishing was a little bit tough, and coming back in, I caught 3 bang, 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 3 fish on 3 casts, but they're all 12 inches long. I mean, it was fun, you know, and if I was eating fish, they'd have been invited to the fish fry. But what I'm looking for is I want that 5, 6, 7 pound bite, you know, and I've had that enough times that experience has taught me, you know, I call them one fish spots, that you'll see one big stump sticking up somewhere, and you're saying that's in 8 to 10 feet of water. If it's in 12 to 15, then you're thinking smallmouth and saying, I'm going to cast to both sides of that stump and across it and bump that crankbait through there. And yeah, you're going to get hung up sometimes. And, you know, but sometimes it's going to be the deflection. Sometimes it's going to be the shady side of the stump. So looking for edges and isolated structure is usually what I look for. You know, when I'm on the bank, I'm usually pitching a jig anyway. But when I get offshore, that crankbait and the spinnerbait and the chatterbait are go-to baits for me.
So I'm going to skip a question here, and I'm actually going to move on down this list because I think this is an important question. What are some of the advantages of being in a kayak and using a crankbait versus, you know, traditional bass boats being on the bank? I mean, what does a kayak have to offer, and what are some of the struggles that throwing crankbaits in a kayak presents?
Marcus, you want to handle that, or you want me to take it first?
Yeah, I'll try it out. No, I for me the stealthiness. When I am fishing shallow, I think I got a little advantage, and maybe being able to get a little closer to some spots or whatever, you know, maybe getting back a little further or something. I don't know, but then the disadvantages, I think, there's a lot more. Any of those real big build baits, they just spin me around. They pull me toward the fish, so I'm not sure if hookup ratio would be super good when that's happening or not. You know, if I'm floating toward them and then they hit, I'm not sure, but I haven't caught enough super deep crankbait fish to know. But I don't necessarily like throwing anything deeper than 10-foot diving bait on the kayak for how much it moves me around and how kind of hard it is to reel them in for real. Even with a slow gear ratio reel, I'll usually throw a 6-4 to 1 or something like that if I am throwing something a little deeper, if I'm trying that out. So yeah, I think that's real tough.
Let's kind of go into, like, one of our last tournaments of the year, the Jackson Kayak Classic down at Kentucky Lake. You were throwing a square bill. Let's kind of talk a little bit about that. Just kind of walk people through maybe that presentation and how you was utilizing your kayak. And
that was easy. I just had to get right up on the bank, paralleling a 3-foot diving little tiny square bill. Like it was a Berkeley square bowl, but it was their smaller size. I don't know what they call it, but man, I was just burning the crap out of it in the morning because all the bait was up shallow. You could see them. So I just burned it through that bait, and I just got hammered every time. It was wild. Once the fog kind of burned off and the sun came up, the bite was a little tougher. And I did pull out like a 5 or 6 foot diving crankbait and did the exact same thing. But that morning bite with that super shallow diving crankbait was awesome in the fall.
And when I came to
I just,
see you, I mean, you were literally, I mean, you were paralleling with the bank, but you were right there on the bank, maybe a foot, 2 foot away. I mean,
yeah, I
there's
could
no
touch the,
way
I
a
could
bass
almost
boat.
touch the thing.
Yeah, there was no
Yeah,
way a bass boat was going to position in the way
right.
that you had your kayak in that instance.
Yeah, and any of those bass boats probably thought I wouldn't catch anything. They probably thought I looked stupid doing it. So I don't know. It was for what I was doing. It was working perfect.
Absolutely, it's a good day. It's a good day,
It was
Taylor.
awesome. It was fun.
I was reading. And I'm not going to mention the magazine, but it's a popular fishing magazine. And somebody said in there, well, the kayak fishermen are hamstrung because they can't cover the same water as a big boat. And I got to tell you, I'm getting ready to do a blog on this because it hit me right in the feels. You're going to, what I want to explain to people is I can take that kayak, and I'm an OG big rig guy. I can take that kayak. If there's 4 inches of water, I can get into a spot. And I've got some pictures of me we just took yesterday, and it looks more like a wood. It looks like a forest with a little bit of water in it, but it's actually a lake with a bunch of wood in it that you can get in there. Debbie caught her best fish yesterday out of that. It wasn't huge. It was about 4 pounds out of that little tangle of wood that you could. There's no way you're getting a bass boat in there. I've got another spot very close to my house where there's a little slough and there's a little cut through that there's not a chance in the world that you could put anything but a kayak or a canoe through it. And again, once you get there, and Marcus, I've been known to say that we call it ninja stealth mode, that, you know, when that kayak is going in there, there is no noise. You know, you're going into a spot, you know, and big fish don't get big from being stupid. So if there's some big noise coming through there, they will almost automatically kind of shut down. And my records show that most of my big fish, hundreds of them, have come from 3 to 8 feet of water. Not to say that they don't live in 20 feet of water. They don't all do the same thing at the same time. You know, so if you're a smallmouth guy, you know, you don't want to hear 3 to 8 feet of water, but the reality is it's about 6 to 12 feet of water for me. And I live on a lake that's, you know, that's got 40 feet of water in it. I got to tell you, when people ask me, I said, I don't know how to fish 25 feet of water. And they said, what if the fish are in 25 feet of water? I said, I stay home and watch cartoons. I don't know how to fish 25 feet of water.
Yeah,
I like to try.
There's always fish in a few feet of water. I've experienced. You can find them shallow all the time. I feel like they may not be the biggest ones, but you can still find them all year.
Well, where's it likely that the most diverse food group is going to be? That's going to be in the shallower water. You know, you're not going to find snakes and frogs and all that kind of stuff in 25 feet of water.
Right.
You know, so there's going to be whether it's bugs or bluegill or whatever, and if people understand that whole feeding mode of what starts that feeding cycle, you know, like if you have a mayfly hatch, the bluegill come in, or you mentioned the bluegill bedding, you know, that is an absolute joy when the bluegill are bedding it. If you've never caught bass fishing the bluegill beds, you're making a really big mistake. And
I chase that bite.
and again, the profile of that bait that looks like a bluegill, you know, again, if it's not the long thin shape, if it's a squatty shape, that's going to position you. And then you got to go back to colors, and, you know, blues and greens and purples and a little bit of red are always pretty hard to beat if they're on a bluegill bite. And, you know, they eat more shad than they do anything else, only because they're more available, but they'll eat bluegill. You know, it's not their preferred food, but, you know, they're opportunistic feeders. And the other thing is a crawfish. And, you know, I like a crawfish pattern, and I don't necessarily think that the crankbait is moving like a crawfish, because, again, for people that understand this, and if you don't understand it, a crawfish walks forward but swims backwards in those 2 or 3 little bursts. So unless you're, you know, you can match that kind of with a jig, and I guess somewhat with a crankbait, because like you said, Chad, if you look at that in shallow water, and I would urge people, when you get a bait, fish it in shallow, clear water first to get an idea of what it does, because that wiggle wart and some of these other baits will back up when you stop them. So that does have a crawfish look to it.
Yeah, that's solid advice. So talking about crankbaits and different things, you know, a lot of us buy them from the store. We buy them out of the package. What are some of the things that you guys do to customize a crankbait maybe before you take it fishing? What do you do with the crankbait if it does not run straight out of the package? How do you adjust it to make it work?
For me, if I'm just going out fishing, I usually won't change hooks if I'm taking it out of the package. If it's Derby day, I'll probably throw some Gamakatsus on there myself. That's usually the preferred one for me. And then I really only had to tune a few crankbaits for real. And I actually, to mention the whole thing about Kentucky Lake, when I pulled one of those crankbaits out of the package, they were running real weird to the right, and I think that was causing, when I was paralleling the bank, for them to run up against the bank, you know, in a weird way, and that may have been helping the bite for it to be untrue, so to speak. It was running into the bank as I was pulling it back, not on purpose.
Reaction.
Yeah, I didn't do it on purpose, but in hindsight, I was thinking about it because I remember having to tune it a couple times. But I think when it was out of tune, it may have caused a couple bites doing that.
Yeah,
well,
for sure.
You know, one of the things, if you know, and again, it's a good thing to live on a lake. It's not a great thing to live on a lake because you get a lot of pressure. And the people here, I have to say, are really good with the kayak community, that we don't have people running, buzzing around us and whatever. They kind of respect the fact that we're in a kayak. And as far as what I do to a crankbait, you know, I add red hooks, and in the wintertime when you got nothing else to do, I've got boxes and boxes of Daiichi red trebles that they're very kind, or another sponsor, that I'll sit there in the wintertime with that split ring pliers, and you can tell because my fingers are bleeding all the time from getting stuck with the hooks. But I'll change those red hooks out all the time. And then, you know, having a friend like Tony Evans at Custom Colors Baits, that if you got something that's just not exactly what it is that you want, you know, that you can go back and say, hey, can you make this a darker brown, or add a little purple, or do whatever, you can do that. And I loved your question about what you do with the ones that run crooked. And for years, I would try to tune some of those. And eventually, if I couldn't, I would just throw them in a box. And somebody was here one day and asked me, said, so what do you do with that box of crankbaits? I said, oh, those all run crooked. He said, well, what do you do with them? I said, I give them to people I don't like.
Fair enough. I like that. That's a good answer. Well, that could be a good tournament trick for all these tournament guys. Just keep all your baits that don't run true in a side box, and tell everybody, you know, when they're having the dock talk situation at the boat ramp, be like, oh man, I'm catching them on this. Do you want one? And you just hand them a bunch of baits that don't run true.
Oh, that's mean.
That is. That's some sneaky defense.
You didn't hear it from us. I'm just saying, you didn't hear it from us. If your buddy at the next tournament hands you a crankbait that don't run right, he might have been watching Dock Talk. Very possible. Gosh, that's a good idea. I may do that.
You know, I think Marcus mentioned this before too, that you don't want to discount those weeds. And when you start talking about pulling them through weeds, that's a deflection bite in itself, whether it's a lipless or an oval bill or whatever it is that you want to throw in. You know, I don't know who all does any kind of night fishing, but again, a friend of mine, Nathan Burnett, even in the wintertime, I mean, he will go until dark, and he catches a lot of fish on the Strike King. They call it a DB craw. It's kind of a dark crawfish pattern. And again, I don't know so much if it's the color but a bass's eyes collect light 5 times better than ours do. So when they're looking up, regardless of how much of a moon there is, they're still seeing that silhouette. And then if you talk about a pressured lake, it does make a lot of sense that, you know, in the off hours, if you want to call it that, regardless of what time of the year it is, that you can get a crankbait bite. I mean, a lot of people don't like to do that because you'll hear I'm throwing the big 1 ounce spinner bait and just crawling it across the bottom, or this, that, but a crankbait bite, a jig bite, there's times I can't think of a time other than, and you guys get ice on your water. We don't allow that down here. We call it hard water. You call it ice over. There's not a time that there's probably not a crankbait bite somewhere. And when people talk about, well, they're on this pattern, if you live on a lake, I can assure you that there's no way in the world that there's not 5 patterns emerging on that lake at different times in different places during the same day.
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
And it's,
I've gotten on.
I think it's a confidence thing too for a lot of people that, you know, if you're losing fish on crankbaits or you're not getting the bites that a lot of people say, you know, I don't really like to throw one. And, you know, again, it's a matter of preference. And if you're just out there fun fishing, that's one thing. If you're a tournament angler, I did that for a lot of years and I moved away from, now it's just kind of fun fishing. If the crappie are biting, I'm going to fish for crappie. If the bluegill are biting, I'm going to fish for bluegill. And certainly the bass rods are going to be in there all the time. So, but I think it's a confidence thing. And it's the same thing with the crankbaits. I got a crankbait in my box I call One-Eyed Willie. They've knocked the eye out of one side of this thing. They hit it so many times that if I know I need a fish, if I'm on camera, we need a fish for still pictures. It's a 584 Oyster Strike King 1.5, and I call him One-Eyed Willie, sitting in the trays of the crankbait. I would cry if I lost it.
How many times have you jumped in to go get it? It's the real question.
Oh, hey, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving that. It looks like I paid for it when I get it hooked up, because believe me, with the ones that work, and you know, you can look at them. I guarantee you guys are the same as me. You can look at them coming through the water and say, that's the one right there. I've seen that more with minnow plugs than I have anything else, but I guarantee you've got crankbaits like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hate it when you hook them and they jump right out of the gate. That's the scary one when they got the crankbait.
Scary. They usually do in that shallow water too. They ain't got nowhere else to go. They usually just go up.
Well, and then that brings up a really good point. I call them crankers and yankers. And if you're fishing a jig or a plastic worm, you're a yanker. And if you're fishing a crankbait, you know, it's a sweeping hook set. You don't want to do that over the shoulder like it just slapped your mammy kind of a hook set. You want to just, you know, if the rod and the hooks and the line are all working in concert, once you've got that hook in them, the only other thing you're going to get is a second hook in them. I know we're all going to lose some fish. Name me a bait where you don't lose fish. So, you know, a crankbait, you know, I lost enough fish on a crankbait to know what I'm doing wrong. Now I think I've kind of figured it out.
Yeah.
For sure. Now, we talked a little bit about grass, but let's kind of back up and go into that. I mean, obviously we've covered wood. You know, you want to bounce it off wood, you want to bounce it off rock, boulders, all the kinds of the hard structure. But let's talk about the grass for a minute. So when you've got a lipless crankbait, for example, what kind of grass are you looking for? I mean, obviously you probably don't want the thickest grass in the lake.
No.
Well, you might be surprised. Go ahead, Marcus.
No, I was just going to say, I'm looking for the thick grass for sure, but there's got to be holes in the grass for me. You know, I'm usually standing up looking to see if there's hard spots somewhere, you know, for either the bait to get or whatever. And I usually look for that, you know, little pathways for them to swim around or whatever. But a lot of times it can't just be straight, thick, nasty grass, or you'll just get hung up the whole time. There's got to be a little bit of hard bottom for me, at least, when I'm ripping it through. And a lot of times there's bluegill and other bait fish up there, and the bass are just behind them.
Yeah, and I got one word for you: edges. Those edges.
Oh, the grass edges for sure.
They're so huge. It's so huge. So you want to, you know, like you were paralleling that bank fishing at Kentucky Lake. If you and I'm a no electronics guy, and I'm not apologizing for it. I just don't do it. I just read the water for what it is. And those edges on that grass, if you can parallel those edges, and one other little thing you can do is if you're throwing a lipless crankbait, one of the things that you can do is put a heavier hook on the front to get the nose down a little bit more. So when it is running through that grass, it's going to just go nose through first, and it kind of plows its way through there.
Yeah.
And if it gets hung up a little bit, when you rip it off there, you're going to be surprised because you're going to get a lot of bites from just doing that.
Yeah, it's crazy how weedless a bait with 2 treble hooks can be.
It is. And again, it's like, it's the right equipment. It's having the rod up instead of down. And, you know, one of the things, if you're working with a deep or with a crankbait that's a diving crankbait, you can get extra depth out of it by pointing the rod down, even putting the tip in the water, or pointing it up so you can change the depth of that, especially if you're running around cover or you're running around a pretty shallow area. You can do that, and it does make a difference whether people believe that or not, but it does actually make a difference. And if you get on a pattern, the one thing I've seen with a crankbait pattern is, I don't care if you're catching, there's a little bitty crankbait from Strike King called a bitsy bug, or excuse me, a bitsy minnow, and you can catch a bunch of bluegill on it. And they've got a crappie crankbait. And in the summertime, we did a TV show catching crappie, just pulling. Well, they call it pulling, but it's trolling crankbaits, big, good sized crankbaits. And I believe you can fire up a school of fish, bass, crappie, bluegill, whatever else it is, with a crankbait, probably as good as you can with almost any other bait.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, me and a couple buddies got on a really good crankbait bite. I forget when it was, but sometime this fall. But, man, we were catching 60, 70 fish a day on 7 and 9 foot diving crankbaits, just throwing them in these schools. And we tripled up, I don't know how many times in these schools. It was so much fun. We spent 4 or 5 days fishing this one area until the water fell out of it when they started pulling it out. But man, the bait was stacked up and the bass were it was so much fun. And it was all, I think, fritz side 7, fritz side 9. And then what are there's another one somebody was throwing that was like a 6 foot diver too, but it's one of the funnest bites when they start hitting it, and there's every cast.
There's a lot of different companies that make a good crankbait. I mean, you want to stay away from you can't find a good crankbait for $2. It just doesn't happen.
No.
So you have to be willing to pay for the quality of it. And one of the interesting things for me with a crankbait, because I was bad at it, every year I try to focus on one thing and get better at it. And admittedly, I was not a good crankbait fisherman. So last year it was spinnerbaits, but the year before that it was crankbaits. And one of the things I learned about that crankbait was, even if you're not in a big wad of fish, and you'll have a fish when you feel it, and we call it knocking it sideways when they hit it, even if they hit it and miss it, they will come back and hit it again. There's not a lot of baits that they won't. It's not been my experience that they'll do it with a buzz bait. Rarely, but sometimes with a spinner bait, that there's very few baits that they'll come back and hit again, but a crankbait falls into that category, and it can be the 1.5, the lipless, the 8 to 10 foot diver, that they will come back. And I don't know if they're trying to kill it. I'm not, I tell people think like a fish, and I probably act more like a fish than think like a fish, but I think a crankbait is certainly a reaction bite to all of a sudden it's there, and I don't want it to get away. So I'm going to try to kill it, because yesterday when I was fishing, and I think I posted on Instagram a big shad that I found yesterday when I was fishing, and put a bait right next to it that says, in fishing we call this a clue, because it's a Strike King number 699. It looks just like a shad, so if that's what they're feeding on, it's not too tough to figure out that that's what you want to throw. And I tell people that if you're looking for a bait to pattern, a crankbait's a good one, because the first fish is luck, the second fish is a clue, the third fish is a pattern. So if you're catching them consistently on that crankbait, like Marcus is talking about, you can put everything else down. It might change through the course of the day, but it may change through the course of the day, may not. They may go a little bit deeper, they may want it a little faster, a little slower, but that's the whole point of being a really good angler, is you change that. And a good thing about, again, with a kayak, this is an advantage. If people say, when somebody says, well, you can't go as far in a kayak, you know what I say? Good. I've got some areas that I work that I only probably paddle. I say only, but I probably to and from only paddle 3, 4, maybe 5 miles at the very most in a day. And I'm fishing for about 6 hours. But I learned that area just like the fish does. I know where they're going to be. I know where it's a predictable bite. If somebody said, if you had to catch a fish, in the first hour, where would you go? I know exactly where I'm going and exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm not running. And I've fished the big boat thing. I've been with people, and somebody will say, well, they'll be going and say, what do you think of the boat? I say, it's great. I just haven't figured out how to catch fish going 60 miles an hour.
I like that.
Some
of my best bites. Some of my best bites have come a couple hundred yards from the boat ramp. I don't go too far sometimes at all, and find everybody goes zooming on past me, and I'm sticking back catching fish that are up by the docks or on the marina or whatever. Bluegill beds, man. It seems like people just cruise right on past bluegill beds and go fish 20 foot instead or something because the water's warm.
Mm-hmm.
I caught one of my best bags on Gunnersville when the water was up close to 90 degrees, and I was literally on the bank just fishing bluegill beds. These bass were just cruising. It was so much fun. Just threw a wacky rig actually that day, but I mean, you don't have to do what everybody says is the thing to do. You know, when the water temp's that high, they're still up shallow.
Absolutely. And one little pro tip I think we could all echo to everybody at home is when you buy crankbaits, and we all know that you love fishing, and everybody likes to stay on the ready. That's just part of it. For kayakers, don't leave your crankbait box in your truck all season long, all summer long. These baits expand in the middle, and they start to tear right through here on the belly.
Seam. Yeah.
On that seam. And
that brings up another really good point, because I was doing a seminar one time, and a guy told me, said, well, we went to this one place in April and we caught a bunch of fish on these crankbaits, and we went back in August and couldn't get a bite. And I said, well, do you understand that hot air expands? So if there's an air chamber inside of a crankbait, it's not going to run the same way in March or April as it does in July or August. And people kind of looked at me and said, how did you think of that? I said, when I'm fishing, I got nothing else to do but think about that. Think about those kind of things. In another, I've got a chapter in my book called Conventional Fishing Catches Conventional Fish. And when people what Marcus is talking about, when people say, oh, well, we're going to go and we're going to be deep cranking. A guy last week caught 2 over 5 deep cranking. Well, again, that might even be true. But if that's what everybody else is doing, I always said, when everybody else zigs, I want to zag. I don't want to be out there, and even in a kayak, I don't want to. I'll fish the water that I believe is going to hold big fish, that I believe is going to get me bit, that I believe if I have 2 or 3 hours, I know where I'm going to go, I know what I'm going to do, and covering all 3 water columns, because you made a good point, Chad. That little bait that you talked about that runs relatively shallow, that 1.0. So you can cover all 3 water columns with a crankbait. You can do it with a spinnerbait or a jig or whatever else but you can't fit. That's just a wake bait almost is what you're talking about, where it's just right in the surface. So you got the top covered. Mm-hmm. You go to the other bait. Go to an oval bill bait. You got mid depth covered, and if you want to bump the bottom, you take that monster that Chad held up earlier and get eat your spinach and go out there and crank that thing for about an hour, and you'll sleep really well.
That gives you big Popeye forearms. You got to eat your spinach to fill them big ones. But no, guys, that's a great conversation, and I appreciate you guys being on the show tonight. First show back, first show for 2025. So it's a good conversation. Good to talk a little bit about crankbaits and some of the different instances that go along with those. So as we sign off, Joey, we'll start with you. We'll let you tell people where to find you on social media, where to buy your books, and anything else you want to tell people, or whoever you want to thank.
Fishing Joey, and the last name Monteleone. You can find me I'm just on Instagram and Facebook. The book is available on Amazon. I've got 4 books. One of them was a novel, but my first book was I'll Be Tennesseeing You. Second book was 60 Seasons, and my last book was Strictly Big Bass. So, and I tell people, if you want to catch numbers of fish, don't buy this book. You want to catch the fish of a lifetime. This is everything that I've learned about fishing for just big fish. If you're looking for that kicker fish or that trophy fish, there's going to be some stuff in there that no matter how long you've been fishing, you're going to say, I just didn't realize that. You can also tune in every morning at 5:25 if you're on the Central Standard, 6:25 Eastern Standard, 6:50 a.m. WSM, the Grand Ole Opry Station, for Wildside Radio, coming every weekday morning. Love doing it. And blog posts, I just put one up for Jackson Kayak, and I'm going to get busy doing that again. Just different blogs about where we're going. I'm not saying I've got it figured out. I'm saying these are all suggestions of people, something that we're doing that works for us, and hope it works for you. And Chad, I want to thank you for having me on tonight. I appreciate it. And Marcus, thanks for working with me to do this crankbait thing.
Thank you, man. Learned some stuff from you. Appreciate you.
Always insightful. And Marcus, you're up. You got the floor.
Man. I got to thank Jackson Kayak, Kayak some more, and you, Chad, for getting me on here and really getting me into kayak fishing anyway. Really, the tournament fishing at least. So we've come a long way, brother.
One can say I've been part of your problem.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. That's what I'm here for. But yeah, Dad's Bassin on the gram, and just Marcas Grubbs on Facebook, right?
That's right. Just simple stuff.
So give these guys both a follow on the gram, on Facebook, whatever. Check in with them, talk to them, ask them the questions that you guys want to know. Our Jackson Kayak team is always eager and around to answer any questions that you guys might have. Maybe it's just talk fishing. Maybe you want to ask them a boat question. They're here for you. So yeah, just whenever and however you want to ask them, but give them a follow. And as always, check us out, jacksonkayak.com. Give our boats a look. Find your local dealer. Go check them out. Go see them in person. Take a demo. And yeah, we'll catch you guys on the next one 2 weeks from now. We'll be talking veterans in 2 weeks, veterans in kayak fishing. So we'll see you guys on, what's the date? I always got to look at the date, but then I always mess it up. On the 20th, February 20th. So tune in. We'll see you here, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Jackson Kayak. That was a lot. I spit it all out, though.
See ya.
Adios.
See ya.